My stepbrother insisted that I leave the house during my stepfather's burial, believing it was his until the will revealed otherwise. 38-year-old Jake never imagined I would be getting ready for the burial of my stepfather. Memories sweep back like a tidal wave as I sit here, organizing old pictures and planning. Death seems to cause one to consider a lifetime of events, both positive and negative. At 9 years old, my mother, Sarah, married Richard, my stepfather. The wedding day seems to me like yesterday. Mom looked lovely in her basic white outfit, hope beaming in her eyes for a fresh start. Richard, on the other hand, seemed to be stressing his austere attitude by wearing a black suit, even on what ought to have been a happy occasion. He insisted on a solemn demeanor that I would come to know all too well over the years. Richard was a rigid man right from the beginning. Particularly when he turned to face me, he always seemed to be permanently frowning. Often, I questioned whether he simply had the means to relate to a child who wasn't his own, or if he harbored resentment at having to assume the position of stepfather. Growing up with Richard was not easy. From my grades to my wardrobe, to even how I handled my fork at meals, he criticized everything I did. "You need to work harder, or this cruel world will chew you up and spit you out," he said almost daily. Looking back, I wonder if Dad was attempting to equip me for life in his own flawed manner. Even if at the time I believed he was just being nasty, his rigidity permeated every sphere of our life. I had to sit up straight, use the proper fork, and only spoke when spoken to during family gatherings. Any departure from his expectations was greeted with a stinging stare or a harsh correction. Family vacations, which ought to have been lighthearted and leisurely, felt more like military drills than pleasure excursions. Richard would schedule everything down to the last minute. Heaven help us, should we stray from the plan. One vacation I recall, we missed a turn and arrived at a museum 15 minutes late. For the rest of the day, Richard was in a terrible mood, grumbling about lost time and inadequate preparation. Everything changed 3 years after the wedding when my stepbrother Michael was born. Richard suddenly had his own son, and it was obvious whose favorite he was. He poured love and compliments on Michael. Richard's smile was unlike anything I had seen until he held his newborn. It revealed a part of Richard the first never knew existed, as if a switch had been turned on. I was envious and furious. At 12 years old, I couldn't comprehend why Michael received all the love and attention while I just got harsh looks and criticism. The difference was clear and agonizing. Michael's achievements, no matter how small, were honored with great celebration, while my own successes were greeted with a nod and a remark on how I could improve next time. Mom would try to reassure me when I protested to her about the unfair treatment. "Richard loves you too, Jake," she would say, her eyes begging me to understand. "That's just tough love. He wants you ready for the world." Still, it didn't feel like love to me. It seemed like continual disappointment as Richard saw me always failing. Our family dynamic changed in ways I never would have predicted. Throughout the years, Mom became ill at 25, and we all gathered around her. Richard stayed stoic even then, but I sensed compassion when he thought nobody else was looking. When Mom thought I wasn't in the room, I would observe him softly changing her pillows or clutching her hand. It was the first time I understood that Richard's lack of affection might have been more a result of his personal constraints than of his feelings for us. 2 years later, Mom passed away, and it felt as though the glue keeping our family intact had broken. Tears and quiet prayers defined the funeral. Richard stood like a monument throughout the service, his face a blank mask. Though the wall between us seemed insurmountable, I yearned for some indication of approval from the man who had been my father figure for most of my life. Looking after Richard in his later years was difficult, as I fought against the restrictions his aging body placed on him. He was as tenacious and critical as always. There were days when our conflict was so thick you could cut it with a knife, but occasionally, too, I felt sparks of gratitude in his eyes, like the time I stayed up all night with him during a health scare, or when I learned to make his favorite foods as he grew too frail to stand at the stove himself. Those were uncommon events, though, and most of the time I felt as though I was caring for a stranger who happened to live in my house. We were living in a tense truce, neither of us entirely sure how to close the distance that had widened between us over the years. Richard's character made me never even consider entering a relationship or getting married. I wanted none of the same issues I was experiencing for my future partner to confront. Richard was gone at 65, taken unexpectedly in the evening from a heart attack. Everyone was showing their respect as I got ready for his burial. Michael arrived with Emma and their children Lily, 5 years old, and Max, 3 years old. I hadn't seen him in years until now. Though he seemed older and more austere, I recalled from our early years that he exuded entitlement about everything. The funeral was a somber event. I stood there, listening to people talk about Richard, A fantastic man who always placed family first, a pillar of the community, and I wanted to find irony in it all, knowing the same man I did. To me, the Richard they described seemed to be a stranger. Michael drew me aside as folks were departing. Once it was all over, I considered that perhaps he wished to assist each other in our sadness, to reconnect or to share memories of our childhood. Rather, he delivered a startling blow that left me reeling. "About the house," he said, his voice laid back as though we were discussing the weather. "I'll need you to leave by the end of the month." Not sure, I glanced at him. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He groaned and cast an intentionally obtuse glance at me. "Clearly, the house was left to me. I'm his genuine son. You never imagined he would leave it to you." I felt gut-punched. This was how it turned out. All those years of trying to be the son Richard wanted, and of looking after him. Part of me wanted to fight for what I felt I had earned over years of conscientious living, but another side of me, the one still feeling like that 9-year-old boy yearning for affirmation, wanted to withdraw. "Fine," I answered, my voice empty. "I'll be out by the end of the month. Not only for Richard, but for the family I never really had, for the bond one had always hoped would grow between Richard and me, but never did." As I watched Michael walk away, arm around Emma, with the kids running ahead, that evening I began packing. Among boxes of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to save, sorting through years of accumulated belongings, I couldn't help but wonder whether Richard had been right all along. Sometimes, you still ended up with nothing to show for it. The world was harsh. Update, I sold my childhood house a week ago. For now, Mom's sister Linda is here with me, trying to decide what to do next. Thinking about Michael and how we got here, I lie awake at night, staring at the foreign ceiling. Michael obviously was the preferred child growing up. Richard doted on him in a way he never did with me from the time he was born, with birthday celebrations, all his friends invited, new toys just because, smiles when he brought home a good report card, all things I had longed for but never received. I recall one birthday when Michael was around 8 years old. Richard hired a whole arcade for his buddies and himself. At the time, I was 17 and couldn't help but contrast it with my own birthdays, which often featured a quiet meal and perhaps a small gift. But as Michael aged, something changed. The sweet little lad who used to follow me around wanting to play developed into a depressed adolescent who seemed to hate everything and everyone. He started to treat me like I was invisible and spoke angrily back to our parents. It was like seeing a stranger seize my little brother's body. One specific occasion comes to mind. When he was around 16, Richard asked us about his grades during dinner. Richard asked us both this kind of inquiry all the time. It was a regular occurrence. But this time, Michael burst out. He began screaming about how he despised living under Richard's control and how sick he felt of the pressure. He bolted from the house, slamming the door so fiercely that a picture fell from the wall. Richard sat there, looking older and sadder than I had ever seen him. Instead of the angry man I had anticipated to pursue Michael, he just sat quietly. Michael's behavior only got worse as he grew older. He began courting a series of girls, each relationship ending in late nights, missed curfews, and shouting matches with Richard that rocked the home. I tried to keep out of it, but the continual stress inevitably affected me. Michael laughed it off when Richard tried to discuss respect and duty. "You can't control me anymore," he would say, and Richard would get this expression, a mix of wrath and despair that I had never seen before. Then came the day he showed up with Emma as his bride. Not even among us did we know he was seeing someone seriously, let alone getting ready for marriage. Walking in with Emma, who was little more than a teenager herself, he announced that they had eloped. I shall never forget Richard's expression. For once, he was silent. Mom tried to calm things down and welcome Emma into the family, but the air was clearly charged. Richard seemed to be straining to keep his cool and to find the proper words to speak to his son. Emma claimed she wanted to live free from family meddling, and just like that, Michael packed his luggage and left. He pledged to visit and keep in touch, but those promises soon faded. Weeks became months devoid of his communication. His calls were always brief and often tinged with conflict. I thought he would come back when Mom fell ill, but he did not. He asked her periodically how she was doing, but always had a reason for why he couldn't visit. Work was hectic, the kids were sick, the car was in the shop. Something was always getting in the way. I recall sitting next to Mom's hospital bed and seeing her eyes flash every time the phone rang. More often than not, it wasn't him. I was the one who had to call Mom to let her know she had passed. He sounded very offended, full of regret for not visiting more frequently. He claimed he would try to make it to the funeral, but ultimately, he did not show up, just a flower arrangement delivered to the funeral home, accompanied by a card offering his sympathies. Feeling his absence like a physical hurt, I stood at the burial, wondering how we had become so far apart. And right now, here we are, not motivated by love or obligation, but the prodigal son returns for what he can gain. Thinking about how he swooped in and grabbed the house, acting as though he had some right to do so after leaving us years earlier, makes me furious. I consider all the evenings I spent caring for Richard, all the doctor's visits I accompanied him on, all the meals I made, and all the expenses I paid. For what? To be thrown aside, as if I never really mattered at all? As I am staggered by these terrible thoughts, Mr. Thompson, Richard's attorney, calls to tell me he needs to talk about something vital. He sounds serious and asks me to come back to the house tomorrow. Uncertain about what to believe, part of me hopes there's a mistake and that maybe I won't have to abandon my home after all. Knowing how let down I have been in the past, another side of me is terrified to hope. I wonder what tomorrow will hold as I hang up the phone. Whatever it is, I know one thing. This is not going to be easy. I toss and turn the remainder of the night, my head ablaze with possibilities. What could be so crucial that Mr. Thompson had to see me personally? Did Richard leave something for me after all? Is it conceivable, or is this only another letdown in a long line of disappointments? Feeling like a stranger, I stood before my childhood house the next day. To my astonishment, Michael's car was also in the driveway. Breathing deeply, I entered. The familiar creak of the front door sent a pulse through me. Sitting at the dining room table was Mr. Thompson, with a stack of documents before him. There were Michael and Emma as well, clearly agitated. With his demeanor unreadable, the attorney motioned for me to sit down. Well aware of the tension in the room, he said, "Thank you all for coming. I know this is a tough time, but there are some crucial issues about Richard's we should discuss." Michael leaned forward, a smug grin on his face. "Let's wrap this up. I want to start right away. I have plans for this home." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, seeming uncomfortable.
"We should really talk about that."
Richards will states that Jake has been left the house and, in fact, all of his possessions. The room went still for a moment. I felt as though I couldn't breathe. Had I heard him correctly? After all these years of believing I was never good enough, Richard had left everything to me. The first to react was Michael. "What?" he yelled, leaping to his feet so fast that his chair fell backward. "That's not possible. The real son of his father is me. He wouldn't hand everything to Jake." Mr. Thompson stayed calm under Michael's rage. "I'm rather worried. It's obvious Richards will specifically says that Jake is to inherit all of his possessions, including the house, his savings, and his personal items. What I was hearing defied belief. It seemed illogical. All those years of criticism, of feeling as though I could never measure up, and now this." Michael was pacing, his face flushed with anger. "This is nuts. When he composed this, he must have been insane. I'll dispute it. I'll bring this before court." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "That is not what I would counsel. Richard prepared this will very carefully. He included a letter outlining his choice and had it attested and notarized. Challenging it would be quite difficult." Michael turned to face me, his eyes blazing with resentment. "You did this, didn't you? You somehow twisted him against me." Still in disbelief, I raised my hands. "I don't know anything about this. I assumed he was forwarding everything to you." Before things could escalate further, Mr. Thompson interjected. "If I may, I think Richard's letter might help clarify his choice." Pulling out an envelope, he began to read. "To my sons, should you be reading this, I am gone. Though I hope to clarify, I know you may find my choice shocking. I have made many mistakes in my life. Among my largest was not treating both of my sons equally in terms of love. I expected too much from Jake, was too demanding, never showed enough affection, and treated Michael too kindly. I never set appropriate limits or imparted any lessons of value. As I considered my life in my last years, I came to see something crucial. A real son is defined by behavior rather than blood. In that sense, Jake behaved as a real son ought to. He stayed with me through trying circumstances and looked after me, even when I didn't deserve it. All the traits I attempted to teach but failed to show, patience, kindness, and responsibility, he exhibited. I am leaving everything to him, not as a punishment to Michael, but rather as a tribute to the child who truly embodied the ideals I cherish. I hope you both have the compassion to see and forgive the errors of an elderly man." The room fell silent once Mr. Thompson closed his book. Tears filled my eyes as a lifetime of feelings surged within me. All those years I felt Richard didn't care, that he considered me a disappointment, but he had been watching, noting, and valuing me in his own unique way. Michael froze momentarily, his face a mask of shock and rage. Then he silently took Emma's hand, rushed out, and slammed the door behind him. His car started up and sped out of the driveway, the last act of defiance echoing as he left. Mr. Thompson wore a gentle smile. I know this is a lot to absorb, Jake, he continued. Richard expressed his preferences quite clearly. He wished for you to have a safe future, free from financial concerns. I nodded, still unsure of what had just transpired. Thank you, I managed to say. I need some time to consider all of this. Mr. Thompson paused as he neatly folded his documents. There is still one more item your stepfather left you, a personal note as well. Would you like to read it in private? He handed me an envelope with my name written in Richard's recognizable handwriting. I took it, knowing that within it were words I had waited a lifetime to hear. With shaky hands, I sat by myself in the quiet house, flipping the envelope in my fingers. After Mr. Thompson departed, I finally opened it and read, Jake, dear. Though I know I've never been good at communicating my emotions, I hope this letter helps to offset some of my faults. I'm proud of the man you have evolved into. Though I failed as a parent, I had a challenging upbringing and never taught appropriate affectionate behavior. I reasoned that the best way to prepare you for life was to be rigorous and to challenge you. I regret the suffering I caused you. Now I understand I was mistaken, particularly in these last several years. Your compassion and commitment have shown me what true strength and integrity look like. You now reflect the person I always dreamed you would be. I apologize for not telling you these things while I was living. With my last wishes and this letter, may you find some peace and protection. Remember, son, you are deserving of all the joy available. Tears streamed down my face as I closed the letter. All those years of feeling inadequate, of thinking Richard didn't care, and now this was overwhelming. In the days that followed, I struggled to make sense of everything. Once a source of stress and bad memories, the house felt different now. It belonged to me in a deeper sense. Legally, it was evidence of Richard's affection. Michael hasn't reached out since that day. I'm not sure if he will, though I hope we can reconcile someday. The pain is still raw, and our distance feels greater than it did years ago. I've given a lot of thought to the complexities of family love and the many ways people show it. Although often harsh, Richard's love was sincere. He was flawed, but in his own way, he was trying to equip me for life and build my resilience. I wish he could have found a softer approach, but I now better understand him. Regarding inheritance, it goes beyond just money and real estate. It comes with responsibility. Richard trusted me to carry on his legacy and to live the ideals he valued. Although it's a challenging task, I'm resolved to meet his expectations. I have chosen to create a scholarship fund in Richard's name from a portion of the bequest, aimed at helping children from difficult situations so they may have the education and opportunities they might otherwise miss. Paying forward the teachings he imparted to me feels like the right way to honor his memory. As I sit here now in the house that unexpectedly became mine, I reflect on the complex relationships between fathers and sons, marked by often unspoken feelings and misunderstandings. Richard and I never had the relationship I wanted when he was alive, but his last act has given me an opportunity to better understand him and see the love that was always there, buried beneath the surface. I wish Dad had told me these things during his lifetime. We could have had conversations, cleared the air, perhaps even built the relationship I so longed for. But life does not always provide tidy endings or flawless closure. Right now, I'm focusing on honoring Richard's memory by practicing the ideals he sought to instill in me. Work hard, be conscientious, and most importantly, love those who matter. I'm glad to be carrying on a legacy. Looking ahead, I feel a mix of emotions: sadness for what was lost, gratitude for what I have, and hope for what is to come. Richard's unexpected legacy has given me a fresh perspective on family, love, and forgiveness, along with financial stability. Though I never expected it, this is a new chapter in my life, and I am ready to face it, carrying with me the lessons of the past and hope for a better future that might ultimately be the best inheritance of all.